Good morning, Paul. It's Monday, the 17th of October. Here's the heads up brief for today.
Thanks.
So, there's increased security in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, over concerns of violence. Three people were killed in ethnic clashes in recent weeks, and authorities are also worried about more violence and crime taking place, especially during the holiday season in December. Now, police have also warned people against carrying knives and weapons in Mount Hagen and the Western Highlands.
That's a
In
veiled that's a veiled speech for you going. So they've placed a new policeman in charge. Sorry, a new commander in charge of Operation Cleanup. So it basically, the head of operational police gets told to ignore all the bad governance, lack of funding, lack of managerial commitment, while we're all rorting things in Port Moresby. I want you to go and solve all the problems of the world with no support. So he's basically saying, I'm going to do it. He's in a very PNG manner. Don't let me catch you doing bad stuff because I don't care about all those peripheral things. I'm going to deal directly with the problem. It would not pass most human rights audits by Americans and Brits, okay?
Yeah, that's very interesting, Paul. Thanks for that. So moving over to Indonesia, last Friday, President Joko Widodo summoned hundreds of mid to high level police officials to the State Palace in Jakarta to basically talk them down and tell them to get their act together. Now, this is after the Malang football stadium tragedy and the Ferdi Sambo incident. So there's been a lot of scrutiny on the police, and the police have promised that they will reform, but it remains to be seen.
Well, it's exactly what I just stated. If you don't pay them accordingly, if you don't set an example at the government level, and if you go and get Western countries to go and give them the world's best equipment, for which they use for some for anti-terrorism and then some for financial gain by having information they shouldn't have or certainly shouldn't be using, it's very hard to clean up a police force when you start by telling them to clean it up. The lack of governance, the lack of budgets, the lack of salaries means that they actually pay to join. So they're in debt and they have to recover that debt. So these rorts that keep happening, it's all about, I hate to say it, but it's all about money. They've created a system. Pulling guys into an office and spanking their bottoms is not the best way to solve it.
All right, Paul, thanks. Well, speaking about money, the date for the Malaysian elections is expected to be announced on October the 20th. Moving over to Thailand, Paul, there was flooding in Phuket, which caused traffic landslides and hampered air travel. In Vietnam, also, 10 people have died due to floods in the central Vietnam region over the last few days. In India, there's a terror alert in Uttarakhand, which is a state in the north. Authorities are investigating whether it's a credible threat or a hoax, but they have increased security, and there is a potential for religious violence or terrorism, especially with all the festivals going on right now. There's also increased security in parts of Delhi. One person was killed in communal clashes over the weekend.
Okay, great. So look, I think this is very interesting. Before you move on, most of the countries that you've stated today, I guess we could loosely pop them in the emerging economies or the developing countries basket. Obviously, with the failure of the bond market, economic storms are ahead. There's a big red flag over all of these countries that are having problem with governance, and a lot of these countries, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, they're particularly vulnerable to corruption. They're blessed with a lot of resources, but most of it gets pilfered away by a select few that aren't applicable to the law. So the red flag is going to expose a lot of these as these economic woes start filtering through the regions and globally. We're starting to see real problems emerging in Japan, flowing on from the issues in England. And if we're seeing a world-class government basically fail to govern appropriately, get too much tied up into rhetoric and personal popularity and party popularity, the economic slide could be enormous. And these red flags over the developing countries, all these tactical issues we're identifying on a day, are going to appear insignificant compared to how They'll go when suddenly their debts are getting called in. Strengthening the US dollar is going to create a real problem for these countries that haven't got their economic fundamentals in place. Meanwhile, of course, behind it, there's geopolitical issues going on the surface. We can see the Ukraine-Russia war. We can see rhetoric against China. But there's a real power play going in terms of if there's instability, people send money to America, that helps them. And thus maybe engineered, but it's also at the peril of many other economies experiencing difficulties. It's too short for the geo-economic and geopolitical issues, but we really need to keep an eye on these because it could suddenly slide badly. So we need to have a chat to Rugger and keep on top of monitoring economic fundamentals and all the normal indicators we look at, include debt ratios, how much gold they're holding, and the fluctuations in currencies relative to their debts.
Yeah, definitely, Paul. And what you said regarding all of this also applies to Pakistan, where Imran Khan's party seems to have taken the upper hand in the by-elections yesterday. It won 6 National Assembly and 2 Punjab Assembly seats. So this will increase pressure on the calls for early elections and could give a boost for his protests.
Okay, interesting. When you started on Malaysia, your intro was talking about money, and then you spoke about the actual money being the precursor to that. What were you alluding to there?
Well, Paul, for Malaysia, it's interesting because the party that's seeking to make a big comeback, the United Malay Nationalist Organization, is doing so to protect its leaders from prosecution in corruption cases. This is especially for Ahmed Zahid. Now, if you remember the One Malaysia Berhad development scandal, Najib Razak, who stole 1 billion, he could get a pardon under a potential UMNO government coming in. So I think money is something that, is underlying these elections.
Yes, I was assuming that's what you were referencing. Old Najib Razak sitting back there saying it's only $1 billion. Politics and
Yeah.
personal power in Kuala Lumpur is a lot more important than sanity. The scary thing in Malaysia is Malays see that as normal. They don't see that as a problem. They don't understand that political parties are manipulating the entire society for their own wealth and gain and power. So again, Malaysia thinks it's above geopolitical, geo-economic issues and above internal social rifts. I fear their day may come. I don't think it's in the next couple of elections, but at some point there's going to be a rationalisation of power there. But there's a lot of maturity that society needs to go through before it realises that democracy is only a democracy if the people hold the power, and that the boundaries of voting and the political parties can't manipulate everything in their own gain. Now, what I've said there pretty much applies to every democracy, but it's the degree of manipulation. I don't think any of them are 100% clean, but in the case of Malaysia, it's right over on the far edge of that scale, which is the big red blinking lights. All right,
Right.
thanks. And what about in EMEA?
Yeah, Paul. So in France, thousands of people protested in Paris yesterday against the soaring energy prices. Now, there were some clashes and there were calls for a general strike tomorrow across the country.
Okay, and what about just flicking back, if we can, to South Asia? Does Thailand continue to be quiet on the political front?
More or less, Paul. There's some back and forth between parties over who they could potentially nominate for the upcoming elections. But nothing concrete thus far. There's still a lot of backdoor politicking, and parties are just gearing up for the elections at this point, but no official campaigning has been announced or is
Okay,
underway.
so gotcha. This week, can you please update the various government um, political party coalitions, certainly for Malaysia, certainly for Thailand, and certainly for Indonesia? We need to just keep a track on how various parties are electing leaders, but also who they're likely to marry up with in terms of coalition to, I don't want to use the word, but I will, seize power for own again. So if we could just update that document, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure, Paul. We'll do that.